Alberta education defines inclusion as an attitude and approach that embraces diversity and learner differences and promotes equal opportunities for all learners in Alberta. Inclusive education as a concept is not a new idea. Janukanen suggests that it has been a part of education policy in Alberta since the 1980s, and I think you would be hard-pressed to find an educator who didn't believe in supporting all children to be members of a learning community. Emphasis on support. However, as we all know, the increasing complexities of Alberta's classrooms have left many wondering if the system is built to support true inclusion. Today, I will be examining inclusion policy and governance in Alberta in relation to special needs learners, so I will be exploring policy around both inclusion and special education as they relate to this practice. Thompson et al. Acknowledged that Canada's charter supports inclusion, but education policy is provincial territory, which leads to variability, so I have narrowed my focus to Alberta policy. The Calgary Board of Education, Alberta's largest urban school board, reports that 19% of its learners are categorized as special needs, which honestly seemed low to me, but in response to this growing need, and in accordance with educational research, actors at the macro, meso, and micro levels have implemented policy to protect programming and treatment of special needs learners within our province. Inclusion does not just happen. It requires commitments from actors at all levels of the education system to design, enforce, and implement policy. The holistic education policy governance approach, as offered by RAZA and SHUA, allows a careful examination of policy at all levels of the system and the ways in which they work or don't work together. In the current system, actors at all levels appear to be in alignment, for the most part. Research indicates overwhelming support for inclusion as a value set and with the necessary supports in place. The Provincial Ministry of Education, or Alberta Ed, governs inclusion through policy and standards, setting the overarching direction around inclusive education. They provide a budget and direct how inclusive practices should be integrated across all settings in Alberta. The ministry acts as the designer of policy. And while consultation is often referenced in the media, many feel there has been a lack of consultation with teachers and school leaders in regards to policy design. These policies are then adopted by school districts, who implement their own administrative regulations, ARs, to govern inclusion policies and allocate the provincial funds to the school through their district. Meso-level actors such as superintendents, area directors, and system principals hold the role of setting the standards and policies specific to their organizational expectations. This happens formally through the ARs and informally in their everyday decision-making. I'm calling them the enforcers. At the micro level, school leaders and teachers then interpret and implement these policies and allocate the funds as they see fit within their own buildings and context. As visionary and instructional leaders at the school level, principals consider the presenting needs of students in their school population and consider community beliefs, needs, and values when deciding the structures and processes that they will implement within their building to best support all learners. What we see here is a traditional top-down flow of policy to practice, as one would expect. And on the surface, it all looks to be working. The standards are set, the board establishes the structures and processes for implementation, and then schools and teachers get to work. But if you flip your perspective and work up the model instead of down, we see a governance model that has shifted responsibility to the bottom and created an impossible list of demands without any accountability to providing appropriate funding and systems to support these demands from macro-level actors. Let's take a closer look. There are several macro-level policies in place to support the inclusion of special needs learners in mainstream community programs. The Inclusive Education Policy in Alberta is designed to ensure that all students, regardless of their background or abilities, have access to meaningful and relevant learning experiences. It outlines 6 core principles with specific mention of barrier removal, capacity building, and collaboration. It does not, however, specify any funding details specifically for inclusion. Instead, it leaves funding to interpretation at the board or school level. Several sections of the Education Act are relevant here as well. Section 33 mandates that every school board ensure welcoming, caring, respectful, and safe learning environments for all that respect diversity. Section 29 gives school boards the power to identify students requiring special needs and then to put forth suggestions for placements in consultation with parents and, if appropriate, the student. And Section 30 establishes procedures for when disputes arise about when the board determines it cannot meet a student's needs. But nowhere in the Act does it say how much funding must support inclusion. There's no mention of staffing ratios in inclusive settings or even set spending allowances for special needs learners. The educational standards in Alberta, including the professional practice standards, TQS, LQS, and others, directly impact inclusive practices by setting clear expectations for educators and leaders. As you can see here, these standards set the stage for inclusion by establishing a need for learning environments that are safe, supportive, and equitable for all. These policies offer guidelines for differentiated instruction, early identification, and family engagement. What they do not offer, wait for it, is any specific commitment to funding inclusive education. There is no mandated percentage that school boards can count on. There is no breakdown of funds and how they should be used to support inclusion, and there is no accountability for sufficient funding. While the Alberta Ministry of Education sets clear expectations for inclusion through policy design, shadow policies turn up in the ways that the culture and values of a particular set of voters may influence the policy and funding in inclusive education. If a politician feels as though their supporters, not the education system, have strong beliefs about inclusion, they may be more influenced to write policy or fund programs that they feel will secure more votes, instead of being guided by best practice. Overall, policy design indicates that Alberta has a commitment to inclusive education. However, close examination of policy at this level gives us our first glimpse into problems associated with inclusion policy at the macro level. Here, inclusion is measured through assurance survey data, student well-being and mental health indicators, the number of students accessing specialized programming and accommodations across the province, achievement of IPP goals and graduation rates, all collected at the school level and reported up the chain. But yet again, no budget benchmarks are set by the province. While support is clear, any responsibility and government contribution to inclusive practice outside of policy design appears to be missing. There is no process of accountability on behalf of the Education Ministry. No promise to fund and design a system that actually supports the policy it's designed to govern. These decisions are left to school districts, yet there is nothing in place to ensure that the funding provided is adequate to fund the supports required. The buck has been passed. Moving to the meso level, school boards throughout Alberta then adopt provincial inclusive practices. Within the CBE, there are several ARs protecting the inclusion of special needs learners, and I have listed them here, but I put myself to sleep trying to read them out loud, so I will spare you the experience. I've provided a summary at the end of the presentation. These administrative regulations ensure that special education learners in the CBE start in inclusive classroom settings, receive tailored supports, have IPPs regularly updated, reviewed, and consented to, are supported by multidisciplinary teams, have access to specialized placements only if needed and even then through a transparent and appealable process, are free from discrimination, harassment, and bullying, and are fairly and appropriately disciplined in the context of their developmental understanding. At the meso level, shadow policies may develop as a result of how principals or area directors enforce inclusive practices. Although formal policies are in place, shadow policies could emerge if there is inconsistency in how inclusion is interpreted and practiced across schools. When measuring success, the CBE has a long list of practices to measure and hold themselves accountable when it comes to inclusion. They're listed here. These measures are embedded within frameworks and documents that school leaders engaged with frequently, and they ensure that inclusion is implemented, tracked, and monitored in their data collection and analysis processes. In terms of accountability, each school district is governed by their board. The Board of Trustees at the CBE, for example, follows a policy governance model, clearly delineating the roles and responsibilities between the board and the chief superintendent. This structure holds teachers and leaders accountable to their chief sup, and then the chief sup is accountable to the board. The board is inevitably accountable to the ministry. So there is a system where they have to prove that they are doing what they say they will, as opposed to actors operating at the macro system who just sort of say it and then walk away. At the micro level, inclusive practices are governed by policies and frameworks that many of us are very familiar with. These are the everyday paperwork, frameworks, and commitment to best practice that we do every day at work. They include both written and discourse policy, depending on the culture of one's school. This work is actually the implementation of policies designed at higher levels to guide our practice with each individual student, and some of them are listed here. These micro-level policies ensure that inclusive education is not only a provincial mandate, but also a reality for students. By focusing on individual needs and creating supportive learning environments, these policies help create a system that provides equitable opportunity for all students. At the classroom level, shadow policies can strongly affect the day-to-day practice of inclusion. As Lorman states, inclusive practice involves adequate resources and training. If a teacher feels as though they do not have access to adequate supports, this may influence the way they interpret and implement such policy. A teacher who's getting hit every day may feel less excited about inclusion, and understandably so. At the school and classroom level, accountability measures for delivering inclusive practice come largely in the form of feedback from interested parties. These measures ensure that school and teachers are held accountable for creating and maintaining inclusive environments where all students, including those with diverse learning needs, are supported in their educational journey. It is at the micro level where complications become evident. We see that the system as it stands now is not built to support inclusion, as there is not enough money, people, or clarity coming from the macro level to support the system it is calling for. The policy calls for identification of learning needs, yet, even once identified, the assessments required to provide an IPP are not readily available. The current system is overloaded and has families waiting months and sometimes years to get assessments through the school. Often, families are forced to pay for these diagnostics privately, resulting in issues of inequity as they are very expensive and comprehensive to attain. There are also instances of cultural beliefs and values preventing families from pursuing formal assessments, as they may be tied to community stigma or an admission of failure. Many Indigenous families have a layered and trauma-infused history with the school system due to the impact of residential schools. This can also impact a family's willingness to engage with an education system that represents systemic power and dominant cultural beliefs. Janukanen discusses the gatekeeping complexity and expense of the assessment process and how it often acts to deter families from pursuing diagnosis, resulting in a sort of status quo in the classroom while learning gaps continue to grow amongst students. Once assessed, macro policies call for inclusive learning environments, but establishing these takes people and resources, and these things cost money, which the ministry has not provided sufficiently. By failing to fund increasing enrollment demands, education budgets have been essentially reduced, leaving classrooms understaffed and under-resourced, and not set up to effectively support students in an inclusive program. This is sneaky, for lack of a better term, and currently outside of public advocacy, there is no burden on the ministry to adequately fund the system it has mandated through policy. This is a serious breakdown. Actors at the micro and meso levels are doing their job and have the systems in place to prove that they are doing their jobs, but not the ministry. They just have systems in place to prove that everyone else is doing their job. This is a problem. We end up with a system of integration, where special education students are dumped into mainstream classrooms with no supports. This is not inclusion. In order to move beyond integration to true and meaningful inclusion, adequate supports are required, and actors at the macro level need a system of accountability to prove that the budgets they are providing are sufficient to fund the policy they have designed. Don't get me wrong, I would never advocate for a system where government ministries are deciding how districts would spend the money. But perhaps there could be a reversal of the current process. Instead of saying, hey, here's a bunch of money, use it to do all the stuff we want. Imagine a system where districts determine their needs, prepare a budget to fund it, and then propose it to the government, opening a discussion between macro and meso level actors to align policy demands with practical applications and costs. Implementing the holistic education policy governance approach framework offered by RAZA and CHUA, I propose a system-wide change not just to policy content, but to how policy is designed, enforced, and governed at all levels. At the macro level of governance, it is time for the ministry to move away from this fund and hope model, with a funding model that is responsive to the needs of the people it is serving. In this new model, school boards could submit proposed budgets specific to inclusion practice, resulting in collaboration and consultation between the ministry and the districts it serves. There should also be an introduction of a third-party accountability mechanism to hold the provincial government accountable at the macro level. At the meso level, school boards need to be devising systems to ensure consistent implementation and interpretation of policy. Trustees, superintendents, and system principals should be meeting across districts to develop checks and measures to ensure norms in inclusive education are based on principles of equity across the province. In schools, micro-level actors need to be included in a feedback loop that impacts policy design at the macro level. Having a voice at the table in policy review and allowing embedded time for collaboration and inclusion planning, as well as consultation with school support teams and other interested parties, will ensure that all have an understanding of the obstacles to inclusion at the micro level. On a personal note, as an educator, I believe strongly in inclusion, and I also believe that it is possible with a strong commitment from everybody involved. Here is a quick peek at my references. I'll just sort of flash them on the screen, and you can pause if you want to take a closer look. And here is just a little bit of the policy explained in further detail if you wanted to do a little bit more reading. Again, you can take a pause if you need more time. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm really excited about watching all of your presentations as well. Have a great day.